Thank you all for coming out here. It's a cloudy and muggy day out there, but in here we're going to be having a dazzling conversation. And so let me start with you, Rukmini. When you look, if I asked you to look into a crystal ball and look at India, not in the distant future, but in the relatively near future, let's say in the year 2030, what, in your view, would be a picture? What's the picture you would paint if I asked you how things would look if everything went right? And what's the picture you would paint if I asked you for the nightmare scenario that keeps you up at night?
I think it's wrong to start with the toughest question, right?
No, they'll get tougher.
So first of all, I have to say that I'm sure India needs many things, and we need to have sort of very widespread dreams about what can be done. I can only speak for the field that I know well, which is education. And to me, the ideal scenario would be that we figure out and are able to implement things that really help children achieve their full potential. Now, if you start that from the early years, obviously it has a combination of health, nutrition, and sort of the right foundational building blocks that can come in place, and that parents, a vast number, every parent here is very well aware of what their children, well, most parents here are well aware of what their children are doing in school. But I think a very large number of Indian parents don't have a good sense and a good grip of how to support their children through their education. So if we are able to figure out, I think, these early years well, if we're able to get kids in primary school, I think feeling, not just being able to do sort of all the basic things that are required in primary school, but feeling very confident about their capability to do more, then I think there are going to be many challenges that come ahead that they will be able to, that families and children will be able to cope with. What keeps me awake at night is if I look at the patterns that you see already. And just very briefly, in every, I think, if my numbers are right, in every single year, Indian population, we have about 25 million, roughly 25 million people. 10 years ago, we had about 11 or 12 million kids reaching standard 8, grade 8. The last set of figures, which are about a year or two old, say that about 22 or 23 million children are now reaching standard 8. Which means that almost anybody today who comes into school has a very strong likelihood of lasting through the 8 years. And in these 8 years, I think that the goal is to just create young people who then will be able to cope with whatever comes beyond, whether it's work, whether it's education. But we are seeing that if I look at the data that we produce in the annual Status of Education report or other information that is out there, that we are putting kids through 8 years of education, but they're getting much less value add for each year that they're there. Which means two things to me, in terms of the topic of today, the potential, is that there is a widespread feeling that now I'm educated because I have 8 years of schooling, and therefore a whole new world is going to open up for me. And yet, when I'm actually at that cusp, I find that I'm well below what I need to be. And so there is I think there's rising aspirations for young people, and kind of what worries me is that are we betraying them at a certain stage that then, and I think there can be nothing, let me put it the other way, one of the exciting things that I have felt in working with Pratham for so many years, that I meet very energized and very active young people who feel that they can actually change not just their own life, but the lives of people around them. And I think for a country to grow, you need this energy from young people. And it worries me that if you create 25 million people who don't feel this, then how can we look ahead to the future?
That's a great answer. Same question to you.
Well, I think Rukmini has laid out some of what needs to go right, that if everything goes right, I mean, just take a number, say we grow at 8% for the next 12 years. You said 12. That means the economy would be about 2.5 times what it is now, which means you're really the third biggest economy in the world, bigger than Germany, Japan, in size. But that, because we have so many more people, the per capita income is still relatively low, which then means, do the people in our country have a reasonable standard of living? For example, have we finally dealt with the problem of malnutrition, which condemns a significant part of our children to a second-rate existence in the future? Do we have kids who now, 90% of them graduate through high school with a very solid sense of the basics, as well as the capability of doing far more, of continuing their learning through life? Have we got the jobs for them, right? And this is extremely important, because the difference between the opportunity that Rukmini talked about, where these kids flourish and see a limitless future and feel very confident, versus one where they're depressed because nothing seems to be available. The farm is no place for them because incomes are really low. There's no real job there, and the city is a terrible place to go because it's overcrowded. Your living conditions are not compensated for by a decent job somewhere. So the difference between those two scenarios, the nightmare scenario where opportunity compresses, conflict increases, and all kinds of divisions start showing up in our democracy, versus the vision where we have strong growth, we have opportunities being created, we have jobs being created, and we feel confident as a country without serious divisions coming in the way. That division really depends on getting our fundamentals right over the next 12 years.
Let me go back to you, Rukmini, with this question about the demographic dividend, because it's something that comes up over and over again. And it seems almost as though kind of the fashion has changed over the years. If you kind of look back at the kinds of things that were written about India in the 60s and the 1970s and so on, the general sense was that India was in trouble because it had so many people. The general sense now, in the papers, in the business press, and so on, is that, when in many comparisons of India and China, for instance, or India and the developed world, is that India has an asset which many of these other countries don't, which is that it has a young population. The age pyramid looks very different from, say, even from China, let alone from Japan and Western Europe and so on. So what part of this demographic dividend story do you think the lay public gets right and doesn't get right?
I think that we talk about some of these big numbers. I think we are very kind of easy with big numbers in India. And I don't think we realize the implications of what that is. So again, I'll go back to some of the data that, recent data. We looked at this age group of 14 to 18 recently with some close quarters. 14 to 18 is an interesting age because up to 14 we have compulsory education. And technically, you should not be working in the organized sector until you're 18. It doesn't matter what proportion the organized sector is of our economy, but that's kind of the, the laws and legislations. So there's this 4 years in between. And if I go with my 25 million calculation, that's 100 million kids in that space. So on the one hand, I think the lay public says that they're all in school. So this is a good thing, because we know that more is better. And we have now, over the last 30 years, been accustomed to the idea that more education is better. More education, we are all highly educated people here, and that's because somebody in our families felt that more education was going to be better for us, right? And so we are still riding on that, on this hope and aspiration, as I said. So I think, in some sense, the lay public has it right, that it is what is going to change India. It is going to be investment in the people. There's going to be lots of other investments that are needed, but investment in people can be the only way ahead. Or rather, I would say, without that, it's going to be difficult to push things going on. But if we look a little closely at what these kids, and I'm just looking at this one narrow age group of kids, there are some very counterintuitive things that we see. And which is why I feel that it's important to look at the data on hand. One is that well beyond the compulsory age, everybody's still hanging on in some form of school or college, which means that this wave that we are on is actually taking us further than the kind of cutoff points, which was 8th grade. 85% of kids in this, at least in the samples that we have, in this age group are still enrolled in school and college. And I bring it up because I think it provides an opportunity. The second is 40% of kids in this age group, this is rural India, are working. Now, are they working at jobs that were created, or are they working? I think work and jobs are, I think, two different things, at least in my experience in India. Typically, they're working with their parents. And more often than not, they don't want to do that work, just as Raghu said. So you have a population which is still in some ways attached to some kind of an educational institution, and you have a large number of kids who are working. And I think that what we are not thinking about, lay or otherwise, is how do we make this time most productive for them? How can we make the part, fine, you're in school, you haven't learned many things. Is there something that you can do right now to help them? Every kid has access to a cell phone. I'm not saying that you learn necessarily only from cell phones, but are we using the opportunities that are available today to really think about the future rather than have some kind of a notion of what the future should be and struggle to say that we are not creating that?
So just one thing, are they still in school because they want to study more or because they haven't learned enough and they're not able to progress?
I think that being in school also in India is an interesting thing, because I had a very interesting definition from a kid in UP. I mean, the truth of, I'm from Bihar, so even up to UP, I'm willing to go that they teach us things. Deepak is from UP. So I asked the kids that, the word in Hindi for enrollment is namankan, right? It's a big word. So I asked the kids one day, what is this word? Ye namankan ka matlab kya hota hai? And one kid gave a really good answer. This kid was in 4th standard. He said, it means that my name is in school, which is exactly what it means. My name is in school, and I'm in school sometimes. And I can be in school more if, he didn't say that, but clearly kids attend. And by kids, I mean even college students. Now, I don't want to ask people in this room how much they attended of college, because there are some very outstanding people who attended very little of college, but did very well in the exams. So our being in school is kind of a, it's a flexible thing. If what is happening in school is useful, I'm there. If it's not, I'm not there. But I'm always there to give the exam at the end of the year.
Let's broaden this a little bit. So, Raghu, you gave an interview recently or there was a thing at the Harvard Kennedy School where you made this statement, which I thought was very fascinating, where you said that by any criteria except comparison to China, India is a very impressive story. But if you compare it with, you can't really compare it with China because China is 5 times larger. But take China out of the equation, India looks great. If you could just elaborate on that a bit.
Look, this is where we get to big numbers, and of course, big numbers conceal a lot. But if you look at India's growth over the last 25 years, it's averaged 7%. Now, 7% over 25 years would be something which, in the 60s, the only sort of example you could think of a big country having achieved that or in the process of achieving that was Japan. Of course, in the 70s and the 80s, we got the Asian tigers achieving that, but they're not that big. The only country of India's size that has achieved that is, of course, China, and which has grown much faster. So before we sort of start criticizing our lack of achievement, let us first recognize that this is a singular achievement by any historical standard. Of course, then we have to be self-critical. Why haven't we done as well as we could have? Why is China so far ahead? Because we started at about the same place in the early 60s. Now, when people look at the China-India comparison, they forget a couple of things. First, China started in 78, really, opening up. Effectively, we had our license permit Raj till 1990, and then we started opening up as a result of the crisis. So we're 12 years behind China. That's approximately 2.5 times GDP. Right, at decent growth rates of 7 to 8%. But the other thing we forget is China actually started out with a much better educated population. And that's something that communism does very well. And that's, I think, the, where India has sort of lagged behind is that we haven't had the kind of universal education of reasonable quality. We have better, at least on a sort of like-for-like comparison, we probably had better colleges than China in the early 80s. But they had better schools, or they afforded people, and that matters because if you look at individual entrepreneurship, the town and village enterprises, that kind of entrepreneurship comes from high school grads saying, I'm going to get my hands dirty and build things, right? So they managed to do that. Of course, the other place where they differ from us is in the nature of government. They're a more centralized authoritarian government. We've had a more democratic government. And across the world, the difference really is the authoritarian government, if in the right hands, if in meritocratic hands, as in Singapore, can be very, very successful because they know what to do and they do it, at least up to a point. I think at some point it starts showing its age. My sense is, China will have to, over time, move to something different, but certainly it has served China very well. For us, our democracy has had fits and starts, especially in doing the things that are needed at sort of the early stage. Building out infrastructure is really difficult for India because we're trying to build infrastructure in a country which is as densely populated as the Netherlands or Belgium. But we need to create new roads, highways. We have a very vibrant democracy. We have entrepreneurial politicians. We have a first-rate civil society, of which Pratham is one example. But we have a second to third world administration. So they're trying to build roads. They're trying to clear the way. They're trying to buy up land. But they're confronted with a civil society which often says, not in my backyard. Don't buy my land, buy that guy's land, right? And as a result, we've had great difficulty building out the infrastructure. It's not for want of, yes, we probably need more civil engineers, but it's not for want of civil engineers or road workers that we haven't got the extraordinary highways and roadways, or just decent roads and decent highways everywhere in the country. It's because, to some extent, we have democracy. Now, democracy isn't a bad thing. It's just that it makes the pace at which we do these things a little slower. My sense is democracy is going to be our greatest strength when we reach the next stage of growth, when we reach the sort of frontiers, and we need innovation, we need really smart kids doing really funky things. And for that, they have to have the space to explore, the room to debate, the room to argue. So I think our democracy is going to be very useful then, but it does slow down the pace of growth a little at this point. That's not to say that's a bad thing. It forces us to think about better ways to do things, and maybe we come up with more sustainable growth path. But that explains a little bit the difference between us and perhaps China.
Rukmini, for you, let's stick with East Asia for a second. I'll share an anecdote with you. A long time ago, I was a correspondent for a business magazine called the Far Eastern Economic Review, and I was their India correspondent, and I moved straight from Delhi to Jakarta. And one of the things that struck me, one of the first things that struck me there was the quality of conversation I could have when I was speaking with, say, the chief economic advisor in Delhi and that same person's counterpart in Jakarta. It tended to be much more sophisticated in Delhi. But the quality of conversation I could have in the taxi on the way to that office was much more sophisticated in Jakarta. And I wonder if there's if we kind of look back now, it's 70 years in, were mistakes made in the sense that India focused so heavily on the IITs, tertiary education, and so on in the early decades, and so you have these, brilliant people on the world stage. I'm with two of them right here, but it seems to sort of drop off a cliff in a sense in India in a way that it doesn't seem to in Southeast Asia? Or is that not the correct way of understanding it?
No, I think definitely. I mean, if you look at the, the focus, the priority, the investment that went into education in the, immediately after independence and maybe through the 60s, that there was a sense in which to perhaps build this new India, you needed these centers of excellence and so on. And I think that perhaps, I mean, I don't know, but I think that perhaps the importance of the early investments has been, the understanding that that's really an important thing to do has developed after that, perhaps. If India had invested heavily in primary education early on, as perhaps, for example, Vietnam, I've heard, I haven't been there, has done a remarkable job with building just their basic, primary schooling structure, for example, and which has enabled them to do a lot more things later. If I look at these sort of Asian tigers, I think there was a period in which you could invest in basic schooling, and it kind of matched the growth of their manufacturing sector in a certain way, and that women did actually very well in that period. So fertility fell, education, schooling increased, manufacturing sector expanded. I don't know if these were all designed to one feed into the other, or it was the time in the world that this was possible. But I do think that as a country, as we move ahead, we need to think not just about pathways that other people have taken, but about what is the appropriate pathway for us, today. Because there are needs, there are constrained resources, and then the third thing I think we don't think about enough is what is our capability today to accomplish the things that need to be done. The needs are many. So even today, I would say that if we don't invest in a sensible way in perhaps the access to a solid tertiary education, then there are going to be people in the tertiary education today who are spending time and money and it's not leading to anything. So, how do we balance these, fundamental needs versus, what we need today versus what we need, 2 or 3 decades from today, I think is a tricky task. And the one question that has always dogged me, and perhaps, either of you can answer, is that we've actually had very high growth rates with very low human capital. So are we getting just too worried about nothing? I mean, is this whole education stuff just, something that is a concern of the elite, and now it has filtered down to everyone? If we had the kinds of growth rates that we've had, and with fairly poor infrastructure, poor education, I mean, what's wrong? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, why don't you take a stab at that?
Well, first, just to your original question, then I'll come to this. My friend, Mr. Sakakibara in Japan, used to tell me that one of the problems in international conferences in Asia was how to get the Japanese to speak up and how to get the Indians to shut up. So your point about, the Indian officials being more vocal may be a point about their ability to speak rather than necessarily the greater. I confess, as part of that group, that I'm very much, Indians sort of speak more than their at international meetings. I think we do occupy the stage.
We shouldn't confuse verbosity with intellect.
I would say that the fact that they're quiet doesn't necessarily mean that they don't know, and they've demonstrated. I sometimes cringe when we try and sort of offer a lesson to a South Korean about, this is the way you should do things, because we, can speak the language of the international elite so much more effectively, when in fact they're 20 times our per capita income. Why is it that we're trying to teach them a lesson? We should know what and this brings me to a second sort of a point. A Korean friend of mine, he was the ED at the IMF, was on a visit to Korea, and he told me, look, many years ago, one of our ministers met with your economics minister. And the economics minister was uncharacteristically concerned about learning from us. And he said, tell us how you achieved this. And so the Korean minister sort of pointed to a shelf of books. We followed that. So this Indian minister said, oh, really? What's in those books? He goes close and he said, oh, but these are our 5-year plans. And the Korean said, yes, but we implemented them. Right? Which goes, I mean, I'm not sure that the joke has any bearing in reality. But what he was trying to tell me, sort of implicitly, the lesson this ED was trying to give is that India sort of promises but doesn't implement as much as it can or it should. And if we could do more based on what we say we will do, if we have that spirit of doing things, much as organizations like Pratham show us, then perhaps we can move further, and that's something to think about. Now, your question. Now,
her other question, which was that if things are going so swimmingly, 7.5% growth, without real investment in education or without education outcomes being that great,
so
why are we worrying?
It goes back to her earlier point that the problems, in some sense, are hidden by the growth rate. The underemployment in agriculture, for example, the number of sort of nephews and nieces of the shop owner that you see circling around the shop with nothing to do, just because they don't have a job, and he's sort of employed them as an alternative. So very, very low productivity in a variety of places tells you we are underutilizing our human capital. And then the question is, well, why aren't we doing a better job of utilizing them? It may well be that we need a better match between the jobs and what we have, but it may also be that they're not really fit for purpose for the kinds of jobs that would be produced by the global economy. Yeah. And I think there is a missing piece. They may be good enough, but we also need to build out that infrastructure which links our factories to the global markets. And if we can do that, then perhaps we can give Vietnam a ride, some competition, if not the others.
And to the anecdote of the nephews and nieces hanging around the shop, I think one of the things that's been quite striking in the last few years is the number of protest movements we're seeing, which are led by politically dominant castes. Right, we're seeing the Jats protesting in Haryana, you're seeing the Patels protesting in Gujarat, and so on, which seems to be obviously kind of organically connected to this.
Right, because what they see, and this is the link between the majoritarian nationalism you see here and those movements there. What they see is the sort of mainstream jobs are hard to come by, but reserve jobs in government, reserved seats in colleges, which seem to be the path up, are sort of locked out for them. So even though they're fairly prosperous middle classes, middle castes landed in many situations, they don't see the opportunity that they were always told was before them. And so it's the frustration. I see those guys getting jobs because there are reservations for them. Why don't I have reservation? It's a complaint that you hear in this country from the economically weaker segments of the white community.
So let's stick with that parallel for a second. Now, one of the things that a lot has been written about, particularly with the rise of Trump, we saw some of this around the Brexit debate also, is a kind of revolt against elites. There's a revolt against expertise. And I would argue that you yourself experienced some of that firsthand in India, where you came under attack from politicians who shall be unnamed for having spent a lot of your career outside of India. I think the term used, which was stuck with me, was that you were accused of being, quote unquote, mentally not fully Indian, whatever that means. Now it's kind of funny in a room like this, but you can actually look at some of this stuff and take it much more seriously. And I would argue that some of the sentiment that you're seeing here with Trump, and that we've seen, in some of this nativist sentiment we've seen in the UK and so on, the potential consequences in India of sort of turning your back on a kind of elite that is seen by the new ruling elite as sort of being out of touch or so on, or inauthentic, could be, fairly dangerous. I mean, where do you come down on this larger debate?
Well, first, I think that particular line of attack was not nativist. It was purely political. It was purely political.
But it was couched in nativist terms.
It is couched in nativist, but I don't think that sort of held much sway there. It was more, the allegations were so ridiculous that it was clear this was just plainly political, as opposed to here's a person who's out of touch. In fact, I would argue that to some extent, you can accuse the elite in India of being out of touch, but it's really about how do you create those jobs for the people who are falling behind in India, right? With the earlier, that parallel, so it is possible for somebody from the Patidar community to say, look, you have favored, you the politician, have favored other communities at our expense. So why aren't we part of that dispensation, right? So it's not about outsider, insider. It's more the inside elite. Why aren't you helping us while you're favoring those other guys, right? In India, I don't think there's much of an anti-foreigner mood yet. It could emerge. But it's more the elite versus the rest. The elite accused of affirmative action projects, which are too narrowly focused. Why is it not for the backward sort of mainstream Hindu, as opposed to for the for the backward castes, for want of a better term, right? So for the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes. So I think that is part of this debate. Actually, it's a lot about the other backward castes rather than the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, trying to get yourself classified as that. In this country, I think the similar sort of the parallel narrative is, why are the minorities here and the immigrants getting a free pass, while the poorer white, don't get any preferment in the elite schools or in any kind of business. There are set-asides for minorities, but no set-asides for me, even though I'm not doing that well. So I think that language is there across the world. In this country, there is an element of xenophobia because we have more immigration here. But in India, I think it's more against the elite, but not so much against the foreigner yet.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. It's not. I don't think it's against the foreigner as much as one of the markers of elitism is a foreign education. And I think some of that resentment.
But remember, the accusation came from somebody who has a foreign education.
That's the irony of it, absolutely.
So I can add here a little bit, I think that to me, some of the current, especially the university-based kind of protests or discontent, I see at least two pathways. One is, there is a lot of agitation about a traditional pathway of I'll be educated up to a certain level and then I'll have a government job and then my life will be fine. And I think that pathway has now withered away. I mean, I think we have to yet accept the fact that this is not really a viable pathway anymore. And so there is perhaps one set of people who are agitating, for that traditional pathway that my dad couldn't get, but now I'm educated enough, so I should get it.
Yes.
Or any kinds of government which is a secure. There is a need for security. One of the things that this year, in this 14 to 18 survey, time and again, whether it's Manipur, whether it is Kerala, this desire at age 14 for security, I'm sure there are many people who know 14-year-olds very well here. It's unnatural, I think that's when you really want to take the risks. By the time you are, 21 and you're, being married off, security may. So I think these are things that they have heard in families. This is things that you've imbibed from your parents. You should have a secure job, settle ho jana chahiye. These kinds of things are now outmoded, but I think that I'm a big believer that these beliefs move in waves. And now we are at perhaps the last wave of it rolling out. I was very surprised that the Patidars were not protesting for young people getting loans. Because that, again, is a pathway, but it's not a pathway that you agitate and get. It's a pathway that you go to your uncle and you get from him. So I think in our minds, what is it that you can get with collective sort of protests? And what do you get as individuals? I think it's a very gray area. And when I look at, let's say we look at 4. We were just talking this afternoon at the University of Chicago with Rob, who's here. The JNU protests were of one type. I think the protests that you see in BHU were of a different type, where there were girls saying that why are unnecessary curbs being put on us. What is happening in Tata. So I think that what are the young people agitating about has quite a lot of variation. Apart from this, I think the point that you raised is intellectual and experts. That's a different kind of I would say, churning that you see right now.
Do you feel it?
I think so. I think that there is, and then there is, I think intellectuals and experts are not the same. It depends on the sector in which you are. There is certainly, I think, perhaps less tolerance of debate and different points of view, or debates and points of view are very polarized. You can't have a broad set of debates. But I do think that this notion of experts in today's India, depending on the sector, needs to be debated much more. And I'll give you an example. And again, maybe my examples are very narrow coming from the world that I inhabit. We were in a government meeting discussing what should be the appropriate step that the government should take. This is what is expected for children. This is where the children are. And therefore, just by simple geometry, either this needs to come down or this needs to go up, or both need to happen at the same time. And I was making the case that although there are these standards, who has set standards and for what? If 50% of our children cannot reach a certain standard, I can't believe there's anything wrong with the children. So perhaps there's some flexibility on standards that's required. And somebody in the room said, and this thing has stuck with me, and I have to say it in Hindi first, and I'll translate, कि आपको असलियत से इतना लगाव क्यों है? Which translated means, why are you so attached to reality? And the person who was saying it was an expert. Now, this is like, I was paralyzed. Like all other Indian, people, I talk a lot, but I was completely silenced for a good half an hour thinking, और कौन सी चीज़ से मुझे लगाव होनी चाहिए? How are we going to move forward? Are we going to move forward on some fantasy, or are we going to move forward on some reality? And I think this dreaming and all that is a good thing, but if I'm completely paralyzed, Land Pritchett, who is I'm a great follower of his, has some wonderful statements. And one of the statements he has is that we are all caught up, and perhaps more so in India than perhaps in other places, in what he calls isomorphic mimicry. That you have a school, and it looks like a school in Evanston. It has 4 walls, it has a roof, it has windows, it has children inside, it has a teacher teaching. Our schools in India look just like that. So we believe that we are at the world level because we have these. But once you start looking inside and saying, maybe for our circumstances, we can't quite run it like it happens there, then you're criticized for saying, aapko asliyat se itna lagav kyun hai?
If you could just sort of unpack that a little, because at least for me, one of the things that really leaps out from your excellent reports are kind of some of these stock figures, right? So one of the things I was looking at was that, I think it was in Uttar Pradesh, where where it was sort of 93%
Yep.
of third graders could not read a second grade text.
He
And
reads
then you
our
had,
reports.
and then you had this other example, which is again quite striking, about the percentage of kids from between the ages of 14 and 18 who could place their state on the map. So if you could just give the audience a sense of this, when you say the difference between aspiration and reality, what does that mean?
So our ASR report, we do a very simple thing, and unfortunately my purse is not right here with me, otherwise I would have shown you the actual test. It's very simple. It has letters, words, a 4-line paragraph, which is at first grade level, and a slightly longer story, which is at second grade level. And we've been accused a lot of being reductionist and minimalist, and education is far more than this, which I completely agree. But at least, unless you can read that story, you can't really read whatever's in your textbook or what's on your computer screen. Now, if I look at that second grade text, and I look at what kids in third grade in India can do, so it's a good example of, are the kids ready for what's expected of them from the textbooks? We have a huge variation across the country. So Himachal Pradesh has almost 50% kids in third grade who can do second grade, and a very high 20–30% who are just a little bit behind. So I would say that whatever textbooks we are using in Himachal in standard 3, almost all kids can reach it. And those who can't can be given some extra help. The same thing in UP, as Sadanand said, about 7% kids can do it. Now, clearly, we need to do different things in Himachal and different things in UP. And UP also is our biggest state. Now, is this a absolutely hopeless situation? Not at all. We, for example, as Pratham, naturally, we feel like we need to work out what the solution can be. How can it be solved quickly? Because we have, many million children in UP. And we find that if you use the same set of, resources, which is adults and time, and children, that's basically what education is about. Different combinations of these produce different outcomes, and some textbooks. We find that even in UP, and I know people in this room who've been there, if you spend about 100 or 150 hours, but start from where the kid is, doesn't matter that he's in 5th grade and can't read yet. This is not an incurable disease. This can be solved. You can find that this can really move very quickly. Now, across the country, I see there are some governments who say, I need the solution, and I need to work with it today. And there are other governments who are saying, aapko asliyat se itna lagav kyun hai? Now, I'm not saying that people say that in UP, but why, if there is a solution that does not require extra resources, you would not want to use it, is kind of perplexing. That means that your analysis of what is wrong must be something else. Because everybody is logical. I mean, I believe that all Indians, whether they're argumentative or not, are very logical people. So if you see a solution that could solve something major, but you don't take it, it must mean that you think the problem is something else, right? So this is just at the primary level. Our belief, and we are very simple people in Pratham, is that if you at least get this right, then many more things become possible. So it's a good idea to just get your basics in place quickly, because then you can jump up and do many more things ahead. Just fast forward to age 16 or 17, the same thing that has held you back here. What happens is, I mean, this is true. If you don't build the ground floor of your building, you can't really build the first floor. So if you're still stuck in the construction of the ground floor, your neighbor has built up to 8 floors, but you're still stuck because you have to build each floor one on top of the other. So there are kids who are at the top of the class who have made it really well. But in Himachal, the top of the class is huge, or bulk of the children are pretty close to the top of the class, and in UP, it's really small. And I think that as we move ahead, what are these kids going to do after 8th grade? With the kinds of learning outcomes that we have, they're not going to go to college. And it's a different discussion about what college is. But they're still, they're going to be functional citizens of India. Our life expectancy is rising, whether I know how to read or not. And therefore, I need to feel that I can at least participate in something. And so in 8th grade, to suggest the kinds of solutions we do, people find that appalling, because how can I be teaching children how to read in 8th grade? My point is, they don't know how to do it. Let's do it. And then many more things will become possible. So I think that what is our perception and what do we feel is okay to do is sometimes based on the kinds of data that we are providing. And then sometimes it's based on this, who do I, this isomorphic kind of thing, like who do I feel I am. I mean, we are not China, and we are not going to be China. China is far ahead, at least on these kinds of things. And so, but we are, quite capable people. In 30, 40 days, we can change India. So should we do it, or should we just say that don't be connected?
Before I open it up, I want to come back briefly to this idea of liberal market democracy. And I believe that that's the book that you're working on now. Now, and I'm going to link this to something a little bit personal. So when I told a journalist friend in Delhi that I was going to do this, and I said, do you have any questions for Raghuram Rajan? And this person replied with one question, which was, why doesn't he join politics? Mm-hmm. And it was meant in a good way. That was meant as, we need people, India needs people like you. Now, I know you've been asked this question numerous times, and the answer you give is that you're not interested. Could you unpack that?
Let me first sort of take off a little bit from what Rukmini said. One of the things you have to worry about are these news reports. She said people want security at an early age. These news reports of 3 lakh people applying for the job of 300 peons. And the peon, is a term for a class 4 employee.
There was a story recently, 25 million people applied for 90,000 railways jobs.
Exactly. I guess this was, this was the Central Railways. But why is the government so attractive? Well, in many ways, it gives you a house, it gives you healthcare, it gives you a job, not very, very high paying, but, it suffices, and entrepreneurial people in those jobs find ways to make money, or to have that's your first job, you have a second job elsewhere, and so on. But the point that we should be asking ourselves is, how come, after so many years of liberalization and growth, the government job is still the most attractive one? Why is it not that these people dream of entrepreneurship, dream of setting out on their own, and essentially take advantage of the freedom that they now have? Or is it that they don't see it? Or is it, going on what Rukmini was saying, that they're not prepared for it, and they simply don't feel that this is something they can run with? Of course, a government job, not too many demands on them, and they feel they can do that. I think this is something we should be asking ourselves. Mm-hmm. Why is it that people don't break out and see? Why don't we have so many more stories of the class 12 pass who's made it really big? And in China, you can find numerous stories. In India, you find entrepreneurial stories, but often these are people from the traditional sort of upper middle class, rather than a guy who came from a farm and started. Maybe we haven't documented these stories as well, but I suspect part of the answer is there aren't that many.
But my question in many ways is a related question, right? So it's almost like it's in some ways the flip side of it. So on the one hand, you have all these people who want any kind of government job, but you also have a phenomenon in India which I think is unusual, and if you sort of compare it with, certainly if you compare it with industrialized democracies, which is that some of the most educated, public-spirited people, both of you, right here on the stage, do not consider a career in actual politics. Now, if either of you were in the UK or in Australia or even here up to, the chances of, not even if you were not particularly interested, the chances of a party kind of reaching out. I mean, in your case, they have reached out and you said no. But, and to me, this is part of the kind of political economy puzzle of India.
Okay, so you were now bringing it back to that question. I think it's a question of comparative advantage, right? I mean, I don't see my comparative advantage as running a campaign or personal campaign, walking, doing the kind of things that traditional politicians do. I would find it much easier as an academic, being somebody who puts together plans, who drives certain kinds of programs, rather than somebody who's sort of accusing the other side of lying and manufacturing my own sort of versions of that. That's not what I have a strong taste for. But you know, I think your point is well taken, that certainly in India, except perhaps for a group that joined with the Aam Aadmi Party, most upper middle class people would stay away from political engagement. That is not to say we don't have good politicians. We have a number of really, very good politicians. They may not necessarily speak convent English, but they're very capable people. Would we benefit from more? Of course.
So we're not going to have that much time for questions. I want to throw this open. If you could just identify yourself and keep it to a question and not a long, meandering statement. Gentleman right at the very back. And also let us know who it's directed at.
Yeah, hi. I'm Prajesh Patel, Mr. Rajan. What was your experience as the Reserve Bank Governor of India?
That's too broad. You need to narrow that down.
Pluses and minuses of being a RBI governor.
I think the pluses are you can actually accomplish a fair amount. Many days when you can go back saying I actually did something. Much harder in the rest of the government, because you need other people to sign on to what you decide to do. You need to carry ministries, many officials together. At the RBI, there are many things you can do on your own on your own means within the RBI, without asking the rest of the government. So that was the plus. It's a very effective organization, very, very capable people. Minuses, I would say there are sort of frustrations. For example, one example is this loan waiver that seems to be sweeping through India, which you would hope that there's a better way of transferring resources to agriculture than to doing it through loans. Because it's not even reaching all the right people, you're reaching only the people who had the benefit of taking a loan. There are many who have been excluded from taking that loan. But it also vitiates the lending culture, because now they're waiting for the next sort of loan waiver to stop paying. I think, there are things like this that we've gotten accustomed to that we need to break. And, it's a source of frustration. I wrote a number of letters to the election commissioner saying, please, can you prevent election promises from being made on waiving loans? You can see how successful I was.
Gentleman over there, the third row on the corner.
Hello, thank you for my name is Saurabh Sharma. I have a question for Professor Rajan. And this kind of goes back to an article I read in The Economist back in probably 2006 or 2007 that talked about, the race between the tiger and the dragon. And it's clear now who the winner of that race is, at least at today's time. Do you feel there's a diminishing marginal return to even democracy as such in India? And if that is so, is there a political economic framework or a new paradigm that we can think of to accelerate this growth further? Because a lot of the problems that you've been talking about currently really reside in the fact that democracy in itself requires a move away from self-interest and to a certain extent for the better of the nation. And I just want to like to get your thoughts on something like that.
Look, I think democracy has intrinsic value apart from anything else, right? The feeling that you can go exercise your vote and that you have the ability to kick the rascals out if you disagree with them. I think that's a very powerful feeling, and I'm not sure we should lose it in a hurry in India. In fact, I think we should fight our hardest to protect that right. Whenever you compare democracies with other sort of possibilities, we always look to a few countries which were very successful under an authoritarian regime. We don't ask what it would be like under Mobutu Sese Seko or under, for example, Mugabe. Those are places where authoritarian regimes, or even Maduro in Venezuela today, where authoritarian sort of presidents have taken their regimes into the dust. So let's not just look at the successes there. I think democracy has more resilience. And one of the benefits is if you go off track, you can throw the guys out. So, I mean, to some extent, again, I keep saying we shouldn't say we've done badly. We've done quite well. Could we do better? Of course. But our system, we need to improve it rather than throw it out.
Are you confident on the democracy question that after 70 years, Indian democracy has grown deep enough roots that we don't need to worry too much about losing it? Or is that something that we need to continually be careful about?
I mean, again, big question. But I was just thinking about my own home state, Bihar, for example. And Bihar has gone in the last 10, 15 years through quite a lot of very interesting political turns. But there's one constant thread that I think is a very interesting one. People in Bihar, in fact, now say, often men say, that this politics ne hamare family ko divide kar diya hai. The politics have divided our family. The women are voting one way and the men are voting another way. This is a very big statement in a state where it's not clear that women are highly empowered. But if you look from 2006 onwards, there has been a strong pro-women set of policies that have built on one on top of the other. 50% reservation in panchayat elections. 50% reservation for a lot of government jobs, especially at the, at the mass level. Big push for education for all, but a lot of focus on girls' education, and you'll get a cycle if you finish 8th standard. Today, for example, what they're doing is, I mean, the whole prohibition that has come in Bihar, people have lots of views about it, but it's clearly a pro-women, And so if in a, sometimes I get frustrated that the obvious things that people should be demanding, they're not. But then I look on examples like this to say, actually, this is a policy that is being, this is a stance that the current chief minister has taken, which, in very rocky political times is still serving him well to keep the interests of women very clearly in front. They have a massive self-help group movement that gets a lot of political high priority. And to me, that today or tomorrow he may win or lose his elections, but I think the women in Bihar are going to be very different. Their future is going to be very different. These girls on cycles, on the one hand, it looks like a freebie that you're giving out. On the other hand, I think the girls on cycles, frankly, they don't go to college or school, that's fine. They go to meet their boyfriend, also it's fine. But the fact that you're independent, you're on wheels, and you're moving out of your village, this is a huge symbol in a part of India that women have been really. So he's still winning elections, and whether he's winning it only on this, it's hard to say. But I think consistently holding on to certain themes and fighting your way through, not a lot of politicians are doing that. And I think it's worth doing. Because
so it sounds like you're saying that democracy has grown pretty robust, strong roots, deep roots at this point.
At least there are examples like these. That if somebody can say, ki mere ghar ke andar aake, you've divided my family and the men are voting one way and the women are voting one way, that's a big route that it has taken. That women are, what you're saying is women are thinking on their own.
Do you want to add to this one?
I'd just say that I think people have grown accustomed to being asked across India. And they would get very angry if there was an attempt to take it away from them.
Yeah.
What I think the sort of concern right now in India and that emerges periodically is that may well be, but do we have everything else that is needed for a vibrant democratic debate? Or are there attempts to silence institutions or create structures that in effect make us a in Fareed Zakaria's term, an illiberal democracy. And I think we have to be careful about that. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We have to make sure our institutions are in fact strong enough when coupled with a broader vote, which should be, I think the Election Commission under Session did a massive helped India take a massive positive step by making the elections finally free and fair. And if together with that we have other institutions which keep at least the exercise of the vote fair, then perhaps the rest will continue following as it has over the years.
Gentleman right at the back.
Yep. Yeah. My question is for...
What's your name?
My name is Madhav Kathikar, and I'm associated with Pratham from last 5-6 years. And my question is for Rukmini. So you explained about the situation of Asar and how, what is the state of quality of students between 14 and 18. So likewise, can you throw some light on what is the quality of teachers in India? Is it comparable with teachers all across the world, or where exactly they stand?
So I would say that, you know, teachers in India are like us. Some of us are good and some of us are not so good. If I think about, you know, for example, we've done some studies. Again, we should look at, you know, sort of systematically done work. If I look at, do the teachers, often we say that teachers don't know, you know, what they have to teach their children. That may be the case in some other countries, but at least in primary schools and on things that are very basic and primary, you know, most teachers, at least in places which we have studied, are able to, they know it. So do they know division? Yes, most teachers know division. Are they able to teach it? Sometimes there's a big difficulty. So, you know, simple things like, for example, I read a text and I find some difficult words, and can the teacher explain? What does the teacher do? The teacher helps you to acquire what has been laid down, at least in India, by someone else, which is thought to be fit for your standard. Is the teacher helped when I give her a situation like UP, or I give her a situation like Himachal? She's not helped. In her training, she's told, this is how you teach a class. But that classes could be very, very different. Often she's not taught. So I would say I don't believe we work a lot with teachers, and we find with the adequate support and a clear goal, a lot of teachers can reach it. But does our teacher training institutions prepare them for this very diverse set of kids in the class? I would say no. Because in teacher training institutions, you're taught that if you're in 5th grade, then you teach from the 5th grade textbook, and you make your lesson plan like this, which is a very middle class, elite school. That is okay, because if the kids are not at that level, then there is parents and tutors and everybody else to fix it. So again, I mean, I feel like I'm saying just the same thing over and over again. I think the raw material, there's nothing wrong with it. But what is it that you want them to achieve? What is the goal? And how are you supporting teachers to get to that goal? When we see that these systems are in place, alignments are in place, often there's a good job that's happening. If the alignment and the systems are not in place, and I think that's true for any of us. We are professionals because we have a scaffolding structure around us. It's clear what my goal should be. If that wasn't the case, I was left completely alone, you know, I may not be as productive as I am.
Well, on that note, I'm sorry, we're just flat out of time, and I just wanted to say thank you, and can we have a round of applause for both of us?
Again, that was a riveting conversation. Thank you, Sadanand, Dr. Rajan, and Rukmini. I really appreciate your participation today. I, for one, am absolutely sure and have a strong conviction that India will fulfill its potential. But it does require all of us to do our bit for it. We are fortunate to have gotten the education. We are fortunate to have been here tonight to hear about this. And Pratham does a very good job, in my opinion, a very simplistic way, as Rukmini explained, with more than 92 cents to the dollar going to the cause. And that in itself is remarkable because it stands alone in that category. And I would really encourage you to get to know Pratham a little bit more if you don't already. And if you do, please continue to support us the way you do. We have a gala later on this year in October. On October 6th, there's a pamphlet on your chair. If you don't have it, you can have any of the volunteers help you out with it. I thank you again for the evening. And one more time, I appreciate it. Have a good evening. Thank you.